Okay, so, and then I'll bring up the text. Okay. All right, so we're up to Sif Yud Tes in the Imrei Yaakov, and we're going to see a little bit of what we saw in this in that sefer that we were learning yesterday, uh, Hashava Saveda Kahalacha, uh, because we talked about this concept of Zuto Shel Yam, of when something is swept away by the river, and okay, so here in Yutes v'chein hamatzil me ha'ari u'me hadov v'min ha'nahar sheshataf ve'avar. He says, and similarly, just like we learned previously, that many times a person can technically exempt himself from the mitzvah of hashavas aveda, but lifnim mishuras hadin, but a person should go above and beyond the letter of the law and do the right thing if he can potentially identify the owner. And similarly, if you have been able to retrieve something from a lion's den or from a bear or from a river which has washed away someone's possessions, afal pishin isyashu haba'olim yesh lo lasos lifnim mishuras aduna lo hachazir. Even though you know that Yeush has already occurred, and therefore it would be legally within your rights to take it, nonetheless, you should always go above the letter of the law. Af al pi shemin hadin eino chayav af im lo nisyashu. He says, and this is true even if the owner has not been miyash, technically you would be allowed to keep it. Im ein yicholim lahatzil afilu al yedei hadechak. If it's not possible to save or retrieve the item, even with difficulty. Shenamar asher tovad mimenu umitzasa, misha avuda mimenu umitzuya etzel kol adam. And we learn this out from the pasuk, like we learned yesterday, that the Torah says if it is lost from him, the owner, which implies that it's only lost from the owner, but it is not lost or out of the purview of other people. Yatsusu sha'avuda mimenu ve'ina mitzuya etzel kol adam. So that's to the exclusion of something which is lost both from the owner and from everyone else. Kaven shalohaya be'ef shalahatzil klal, since it was not possible to retrieve it, unless you used extraordinary measures, like you got an expedition with a bunch of hunters to go and kill the lion, right? But I guess that's not considered within reasonability. It's considered to be lost from everyone. Va'afim hu omed v'tzavach nase kitzavach al beso shenafal val sfinos shetava bayom ve'ein mashkichen klal al masha omer she'eno mityaesh ki botla dato etzel kol adam. And even if a person is yelling and screaming and saying, I'm going to get this back, but it's meaningless, because it's no different from if a person were to scream and cry over his burning house or his sinking ship. It doesn't mean that he can get it back. It just means that he's emotionally distraught. And therefore, there's for sure Yeush there, even if he says he's not Miyash, because his thoughts are nullified vis-a-vis everyone else who would be normally thinking about that it's gone forever. Um, okay. Okay. Now let's see. Let me just see if in the Biurim. Okay. Yeah. So here remember we talked about a shipwreck, right? Even though that halachically, if a ship wrecks and it sinks, and you want to go scuba diving and retrieve the lost objects, halachically you're permitted to do so. But nonetheless, you should try to go lifnim mishuras adin. And the Likutim writes over here, umikol makom, im gozar hamelech, o beis din, chayav lahachzir mikoch dina de malchusa o hefker beis din. If even though you're exempt from returning it, but if the government or a beis din decrees that you have to return it to its original owner whose ship was wrecked or who was on the ship, so you have to return it based on dina de malchusa dina, or the authority of the beis din, which can declare financial issues to be legally binding. V'lachein pasku zal basfina shetava bayam shegazer hamoshel v'gam hakihilot. He says, therefore, there was a ruling from the rabbis regarding a ship that sunk, and the government made a rule that shekol mi shekona min ha'akum shehitzilu min ha'aveda hahi sheyachzer leba'olav shetzrichim lahashiv. So the government made an edict when it came to a shipwreck, and they said that if anyone purchases from the people who retrieved the sunken treasures, that they have an obligation to return it to their original owners. Ve'ein lo min ha'ba'olim elama shenasan. And the only thing that the purchaser is entitled to is a refund of his money, even if the object that they paid for is worth much, much more. You know where this would come into play? Let's say a very valuable artwork that was confiscated by the Nazis during World War II, and we know which families it belonged to. So even though you could argue that halachically, how are you going to retrieve that from the Nazis? The Nazis took it, it's not retrievable. And therefore maybe a person could say that technically he's exempt from returning it to the families. But if the government says you have to return it, it's rightfully theirs. So then, and it was certainly, especially because it was confiscated from these people unfairly and illegally, so then it would be an obligation to return it. Uvemakom sheyesh dina de malchusa lahashiv aveda o limsor lemishtara, and wherever there's a governmental law in place that you have to return this lost object, or you have to at least surrender it to the police, efshir da'af midina Yisrael yesh makom l'chayvo al kol panim b'makom shirov Yisrael mitzuyim. Then certainly we could even halachically obligate a person to do this, and that's certainly true when the majority population is Jewish. So for example, in Israel today, if the government has a law in their books that says that, if you find a valuable item, you have to return it you have to surrender it to the authorities, so then you're obligated to do that. Uva'aveda shemidina Yisrael chayv lahachriz v'yodea sheha'avedot hanimsorot lemishtara muchzarot lebaleihen sarich limsor lemishtara ke'echat midarchei ha'achraza l'chol ha'pachot. So in a situation where halacha requires you to announce that it's lost, and the government says that you should surrender it to the police, so then surrendering to the police is one form of making an announcement. In other words, assuming that the police do their job, and when they retrieve lost items, they return it to their owners, which is a fair assumption. We're not dealing with corrupt police forces. If the police are able to retrieve something that's lost, then you can give it to the police and safely assume that if the owner is seeking it, they will get it back. And so therefore, one way to make good on Hashavas Aveda, today it's not so easy to make a public announcement that you found something. There's no central bulletin board for the Jewish community in Thornhill. So sometimes it might make sense that if you find something of value, that you contact the police and you say to them, I've lost, I found this lost object. Do you have a lost and found? And I don't know if has anyone ever done this. I don't know, but I would assume that the police, the York Regional Police, have lost and found department.
I know, Rabbi, there is one on the TTC, right? If you find something on the TTC, you give it to the collector, and then they have a lost and found at one of the subway stations somewhere. And I think after a period of time, they sell it off. They have like an annual sale where they sell unclaimed things.
Interesting. Okay. You'll have to let us know when that sale is coming up.
They usually
Ra-
sell it in bulk, like 12 umbrellas in lots or something like that, because so many people lose umbrellas.
Uh-huh. Right.
Rabbi, also, I think if something that really has some value to it, I would find it difficult how we could possibly trust the society we're living in today. That especially if it's something like a ring or something that has some real value, even if it has a simon on it, that would not be taken by the someone in the police force or somebody that would not take it for themselves. It'd be, the society we're living in today, it would be very difficult, even though we could be a great role model in showing how we gave that in to that person whoever we gave it into in the police station. But I would think a very small chance that it would end up at the owners if it really had a significant value.
How do the rest of you feel about that?
Well, I'm wondering whether they're obliged to record it if they receive something. Like, I don't know whether they can just put it in the drawer. Like, I think they probably have to make record of the fact that they received it. I would think if it's of great value. I don't know be interesting to speak to a police officer. I wonder whether Ralph knows something about this or,
Should really, I'll have to ask Ralph the next time I speak to him. Um, but I would imagine that they have to take a photograph of it, and it has to be recorded. But I don't know. I don't know. Okay.
I was wondering, Rabbi, about these people who walk up and down the beach with metal detectors looking for
The beachcombers.
lost items. Yeah. So are those things they find people with miayish and they can keep them, or
Yeah, that we learned that was one example. Is that if a person finds something that's buried in the sand, that's an example of zuto shel yam, because you can assume that it's considered to be lost like buried treasure. That it's unless a person goes to extraordinary measures, he's not going to be able to find it. So um, it's certainly, you can assume that the owner, even if it's not zuto shel yam, but if it's been abandoned, and you can assume that the owner has had yeyush already, and so it would be okay to keep it. Has anyone ever done any beach combing?
seen people do it, but have it not myself.
Okay, all right. And then he has the example of, which is something that I raised about Holocaust retrieval. Svarim sheniknu me anashim shalakchu me chayalim rusim sheshalalu mi Yehudim. His example, where he's quoting the Minchas Yitzchak, I think that's Rav Yitzchak Weiss, from the Badatz based in. If you purchase books from Russian authorities who had confiscated these goods, like the Cossacks who had confiscated these goods from Jews, v'hasvarim hayu kfar me'utadim li'ibud, and these were destined for destruction anyway, because they were planning to burn them or to use them as wallpaper or whatever they were going to use them for. Idinam kimatzel mizuto shel yam, ayin mashakasav b'shailos utshuvas Imrei Yosher chelik beis simen tes, va'od ayin minchas Yitzchak chelik ches simen samach tes os beis. He says, take a look at those responsa, and you'll see some interesting things. So why don't we take a look at that? Um, uh, what I'll probably do is here. Let me just see if I can bring that up very, very quickly.
Okay, as you're working on that, I just looked up on the internet about filing lost item claim with the police. It says the Toronto Police Service will only accept reports over the phone for lost items that have an externally visible serial number and are worth more than $500, or it's determined there's a public interest in recording the detail of the lost item. if you lost, and then it goes on. If you lost property in the cab, contact them. If you lost passport, contact Services Canada, etc. So depending on what the item is, but if it's a general item, and it says lost property are not actively investigated by Toronto Police Services and are kept for records purposes only in order to reunite people with their property if recovered. So it sounds like they have some system, and I presume that if someone turns it in, they record all that information, and then if you lost it, they try and match it.
Right, but it's got to be worth $500 or more.
Yeah, and it almost sounds like it really should have a simon.
Yeah.
Right? Of sorts.
Yeah.
So,
okay, so it's in Shilas Tshuvos Imrei Yosher. Well, so the problem would be is that, let's say you find a wedding ring, which has sentimental value to the person who owned it.
I just closed the site, but I think it said or. So if it doesn't have a serial number, but it's of value more than $500, I guess it would qualify to be turned in.
Right. Well, a wedding ring has neither a serial number.
Right, but it's over $500 value. So.
Right. Okay, so let me show you this tshuva.
If you want your wedding to last.
Yeah.
It's not a crackerjack ring.
Yeah, no, most wedding rings are under $500. It's a gold band you can buy for $100, but it has sentimental value.
Oh, I suppose.
Yeah. Okay.
Maybe I'm thinking of an engagement.
You're thinking of a diamond ring.
Yeah.
Okay, so here it is. Bidvar inyan hasfarim asher kanu me'anshei chayil shalanu asher hem lakchu miyad harusim asher shalalu miyisraelim. So you have Jewish books that were purchased from soldiers, which were purchased from Russians who confiscated these goods from Jews. V'hasvarim kvar hayu me'utadim li'ibud chas v'shalom al yedei anshe chayil ki ratzu lechatcham lechatichos dakos v'lasos mehem niyar. So they were planning to destroy the books, grind them into wood pulp or paper pulp, so that they could manufacture new paper out of them. And you managed to be able to stop them and say, "Listen, guys, I'll pay you a good price for them," and you were able to save the Sfarim. And Baruch Hashem, you were able to save Holy Writ from destruction. So now the question is, right? Asher nistapek kvod toraso im havi kematzel mizuto shel yam, da havi avut mikol adam. This is something that's analogous to zuto shel yam if it gets like sunk in the ocean, because it was lost from everyone. The imkain mishuras hadin havi shel hakonim rak mitzad lasos hayashar v'hatov. So he says the letter of the law would therefore dictate that whoever purchased this Judaica would be allowed to keep it, and only as a matter of doing the above and beyond the letter of the law, to do the right thing, you wanted to argue, he's speaking to the person who sent him this query, you want to argue that only as far as going beyond the letter of the law should you feel any obligation. V'hinei lo matzinu da'avud mikol adam, rak b'matzil mizuto shel yam, dekvar hava avud. So he says, now the fact of the matter is that this concept of zuto shel yam is only when it's completely outside the purview of all human beings, right? So it goes into the ocean. V'chein tarnagolim shebarchu b'choshen Mishpat simin reish chavtes dahavui avudim mikol adam. He says, or when chickens fly the coop and they run into the wild, so there's no people there, and therefore it's considered to be lost from everyone. Aval kemo b'nidon didan shehachayil ratzu lechatchan keven shadayin lo asu lo dami lezuto shel yam. So the Imrei Yosher, which is probably written around the turn of the 20th century, says that in this situation, as long as the army has not cut it into pieces, it's still within the purview of human beings. And as long as they haven't chopped it up yet, it's not like Zuto Shel Yam, and it could be that even halachically you're obligated to return it to its owners. Uve Mordechai Perek Hagozel Basra Siman Kuf Ayin Aleph Kasav. The Mordechai is one of the Rishonim, one of the medievalists, and he writes, Hadleika she nafla be'ir, v'ha'esh haya kofetzes lekan ulekan, u'baruchu b'nei adam min ha'ir lepachad hadleika. He says, let's say a fire breaks out in the town, and people are fleeing because everything's being burnt down. V'amad Yehudi echad v'hitzel sefer echad, u'ba'aleha baruchu min ha'ir. And he writes as follows, there's one Jew who ran into a burning building and saved a Sefer Torah, or saved a special book, okay? And the owner had already fled, okay? So, Eino chayav lahachzir leba'alim, dehamatzi omar me hefkera kazachina ayin sham. So the Mordechai wishes to argue in that situation that the Jew who saved the Sefer Torah could say, it was Hefker by that time, because you already had Yeush, because you had given up, because you figured that the house was burning down, and the Sefer Torah was going to burn with it. So therefore, the Mordechai makes the argument that the person who ran into the burning building and saved it is allowed to keep the Sefer Torah. V'huva b'kitzur b'choshen Mishpat siman reish samach dalid, v'sham lo nizkar sefer rak b'mordechai hanal. He says, and it's brought down in very short form in the Shulchan Aruch, quoting this Mordechai, but the example there is not given of a Sefer Torah, just as any object that was saved from a fire. The gam kein lo dami linidon didan kevin tikvar haya hadleika kofetzes havi kizuto shel yam. He says, but that's not analogous to our situation, because in that situation also, it was considered to be lost from all of humanity, because no one rational would run into a burning house. And therefore, this guy who did something extraordinary is considered to be doing something, it's still considered to be outside the purview of every human being. Ach beguf hadavar be'inyan sfarim, af im lo nechshav kezuto shel yam, efshar ladun dahavi yeush. But nonetheless, there still could have, even if it's not kezuto shel yam, because it's being held by the army and it's within the purview of human beings, but nonetheless, we may have to consider that the owner had a bona fide yeush, because once the Cossacks come and they take everything, that's it, game over. You're never going to see that again. The kasher chamsu harusim asfarim habolim yeyoshu. As I just said, shouldn't we assume that there was absolute yeush when the Russians invaded his home? V'hinei b'sha'ar hachafatzim sheshalu harusim bevadei havi yeush. He says, certainly when it comes to other items, let's say valuables, jewelry, and things like that, candlesticks, then certainly the owner had yeush. After anan kaimalan destam gezela lo havi yeush afilu begazlan Yisrael mal kol shekein begazlan nachri kimavur b'shachoshen Mishpat siman shin peiches. He says, but it's important to know that with normal stolen goods, if someone is the victim of a robbery in their home, someone breaks into your home and steals your jewelry and your candlesticks. So the Shach, which is a commentary on the Shulchan Aruch, says that does not constitute Yeush, because the owner still holds out hope that maybe his goods will be retrieved. Avolav klalahu rak the stam gzela lo havi yesh the sover litvoa bedina Yisrael ol be'erkos. He says, because in that scenario, the victim of the robbery is hoping that the police will catch the guy, or that a detective will track the stolen goods down, and he might retrieve them. Aval im hagazlan hu gever alum v'yorei litvoa havi yesh kamo shekasav noda b'Yehuda. And uvenidon dedan havi vaday dekavasi. But let's say you know that it's the mafia steals your goods. Then already, because of the power of the mafia, you have to assume you're never going to see that again. In other words, when you're dealing with a body of marauders or people who confiscate goods that have the government, they are doing it unopposed by government authorities, either because they're the mafia or because they are the government authority, like the Russian Cossacks. So then in that situation, surely the person will have Yeush. Ki ha'yoreim litvou l'hodi'ah hadavar laharoshim shel harusim v'havi vada Yeush. If you take up a case against the Cossacks to the Russian government, the Cossacks will come and cut you up into little pieces, right? Rak bisfarim kasva aposkim delo havi Yeush ki mavur b'choshen Mishpat siman reish lamed vav. So he says the only exception to that rule is if it's holy writ, if it's like books and other kinds of Judaica. And why is that the owner may not have Yeush? He says, V'hainu disover ha'Yisrael, d'ze ein lo shivoi etzel hanochrim, rak yimkarenu liYisrael v'yovo achar kach liyado. He says, because the Jew is holding out hope that the Cossacks will see these books, they will see no value in them, and so they'll sell them to a Jew. And as a result, maybe I'll be able to retrieve it. So, even today, a stolen Sefer Torah, a person's not going to have Yeush if a group of thugs break into the shul and steal the Sefer Torah, because you can rest assured that they'll probably sell it to someone who finds value in it, and if that person's a Jew, maybe the Jew will be a good person. We should assume that if he knows what the value of a Sefer Torah, he's going to want to abide by the laws of the Torah, and therefore maybe you'll be able to get it back. Kimavur sham ta'amam v'im kain ein ze klal Yeush b'shum ofen. He says, and therefore, when a person has his Judaica confiscated by the authorities, then there is no Yeush. I know that after the Holocaust, there were a number of Sifrei Torah. My mother has a friend who told the following story, that her husband was once walking through the streets of, I'm not sure if it was France, I think it was France, it's probably Paris, and a guy comes up to him and says, he was selling stuff, and the guy and this fellow who was a Jew who was walking by noticed that one of the things he was selling was a scroll, a Sefer Torah scroll. And I think he was scared to admit that he was a Jew because he didn't want to get himself into trouble. So he said, "Oh, that would be good for plastering on a roof, to waterproof a roof because of the parchment value of it." And he was able to buy it and then got it brought to the U.S. and it was on display in his shul as a Sefer Torah that was retrieved from the Shoah. He says, now obviously in that situation you can probably assume that the owner is probably deceased. But in other situations, like the one with the Cossacks, then then you have to be worried that maybe the like the scenes in Fiddler on the Roof when the Cossacks come and invade Anatevka, so maybe when it comes to Judaica, the Jew will not have Yeush. B'imkein ein ze klal Yeush b'shum ofen, v'rak kefi hanishma sha'arusim kame pa'amim sarfu hasfarim v'shlichu li'ibud shaper havi Yeush. It's only if the practice of the Russians is to take those Sifrei Torah and to burn them, and you suspect that your religious items have been burned, so then if that's the practice, then that would constitute Yeush. V'davka bistam gazlan demistam bahanas dameha yimkarenu. And therefore only when it comes to other kinds of thieves would we say that they're going to want to sell them. But perhaps when it comes to the Russian authorities, because they're communists and they wish to suppress religion, maybe there it's different, that there would be Yeush. Okay, so he goes back and forth. So you see it's actually a very interesting, it goes on for quite some time, but it happens to be a very interesting discussion. Okay.
Rabbi, on that Judaica lost, I'm thinking about sort of artwork that was stolen by the Nazis, and you hear about it occasionally. I just did a quick Google as the Rabbi was speaking painting returned 87 years after Nazis stole it from a Jewish family in Berlin. So, I mean, it happens, right? And
Yep.
so you wouldn't have thought it would ever be returned to its rightful owner. But I guess on that basis, you can't necessarily presume that would happen, but it can happen.
Well, I mean, I think that there's a recognition in today's world that we have to sort of rectify the sins of previous generations, and so in today's world, one should prosecute against any museums who are still holding art that was obtained by the Nazis, and it could be that there are governmental rules that are in place to create methods of restitution from Nazi atrocities. So in that situation, like that's again Dina de Malchusa. If halachically the owner probably had Yeush at some point when the Nazis came and confiscated their art, that would not go against the fact that the law of the land in today's world dictates that you have to give it back to the family.
There was a film, Woman in Gold.
That's right.
Based on a
Yes.
true book.
Yep.